All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and jump in here. I know I know of a few that are going to be out. I know a few are coming. Chelsea was dropping off soccer practice, and so she'll be here. And did you? Yeah, so she should be back. Yeah, she did. Okay, good deal. So she should be here, and so maybe a few other stragglers, and so. Let's jump in. If it's all right with you, I'm going to change up. Tonight's going to look different anyway, so I thought let's just make it look completely different. And so rather than starting with the 8 principles, I thought just given what we're training on, and again, just that it's different, let's start with the Serenity Prayer instead, just as a way to kind of focus ourselves. So that's on page 12 in book 2. I don't know about you all, but May has got me like all crazy, and so I think maybe May is crazy. I didn't really know. Yeah, so school stuff, end of school stuff, and just So I think it might be good for us to start with the Serenity Prayer instead, if that's okay. If that's okay. Just don't tell the CR police that we started this way. All right. Thank you. So, all right, here we go. Page 12. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it. Trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. That feels better, right? All right. A couple housekeeping things real quick. This Friday is our first, the Friday night uptown. So we've got a booth there. And so this is going to be really low key. And truthfully, I looked at the weather for Friday, and it looks kind of miserable. And so I don't know what this is going to look like. But I don't think that Emily. Did they ever cancel? Unless it's like a tornado coming through, maybe. Yeah. So there will be people there doing whatever, and so I'll be there. And so I'm just going to invite. We didn't really do like sign-ups or anything like this, but if you want to come out, hang out. 6 o'clock is when it starts, and we'll be there till cows come home or till you decide to go home yourself. And so we'll have just a few games. We're going to hand out some popsicles and things. I do have, we got a Celebrate Recovery flag kind of thing, so that'll be setting out there. We're in the kids wing, so it gets kids focused. So we're not necessarily like actively recruiting Celebrate Recovery per se, but we will have it, like it's there. We want it to be visible. So that'll be there. We do have some very generic postcards, just letting people know that we are starting this and when the launch date is. And so I've got a small stack of those up here. If you want to take a few, and you're going to be at some places this week or something over the next few weeks where you can just drop one of these or post it somewhere, feel free to do that. We'll have those available when we're there at Friday Nights Uptown. And so, like I said, if you want to come hang out with me, by all means, feel free to. If you don't, that's okay. You don't hurt my feelings. It's fine. They do not. So right now they say at the Nazarene Church. And so this is kind of our go-between postcard, because we're not ready, we don't have logo yet and things like that. And so, this is our Band-Aid postcards that just say at the Nazarene Church right now, because we're Marysville Nazarene Church now, and we'll be the Church of Nazarene Church, whatever. And so, yes, good question. So Friday Nights Uptown, just if you've been there before to work, we're in a different location this time. So just a heads up, if you do want to come, where the library's at, the little book drive-through drop-off container things, whatever, I don't know what you want to call them. We're going to be right around there, okay? So the main drive into the library is where we'll be. We'll have a tent set up there. So just throwing that out there. If you don't find us, then just wander around for a while, and eventually you'll find us. All right. We're not the beer tent with the CR Marysville Nazarene Church. Okay, just clear that up. Okay, housekeeping things. Check. Checking them off. Okay. Like I said, tonight is a little bit different. You didn't have homework to do over the week. If you did do some sort of homework, that's awesome, fantastic. You didn't have to have anything done. We're not going to break off into our discussion groups tonight. What we're going to do is we're going to take kind of an in-depth look at this whole inventory process. I know some of you have been looking at that this week and have just been kind of like, some of you have started on it, I know, and some of you are like just thinking about it, and that's awesome. And maybe it's been good for you. Maybe it's been a little bit overwhelming for you. Maybe you ran away and you're like, I'm never doing this again. But you still showed up tonight, so thank you for doing that. Tonight, hopefully, as we go through just this session, you'll at least kind of have a better grasp on what does this actually look like, right? And hopefully, in that, you won't be maybe so kind of like overwhelmed. I know after I've gone through these things, I'm like, okay, I think I have a pretty good grasp on this now. It's still going to be a lot of work, right? It's still going to be hard work. But I at least kind of have a better understanding of what this is supposed to look like. So my hope is that after tonight is over, you will have kind of that better understanding as well, okay? And so what we're going to do is I'm just going to kind of walk through the process a little bit, and then we'll close our time by watching. There's about a 20-minute video of kind of a whiteboard walkthrough of an example of this inventory process. So kind of one of the national trainers, she's in a room with a few people, and she's kind of writing out their things on a whiteboard. So we'll talk about it. We'll talk about the concepts here, walk through the process, and then we'll actually see that in action. All right? So I'll probably try to take a little bit, maybe just a couple-minute break here about halfway through or so. Just since we're sitting here, we're not getting up to move to our stretch or anything like that. We will do that. So, all good? All right, super. So we're going to start. Let me put this book away because I don't need it right now. Hopefully you grabbed both packets when you came in. One says the fourth step training guide for step study groups. It looks like this. And then the other one has a couple more pages, and it's kind of a lot of blank forms that will make a little bit more sense as we go through this. We're going to start with the one that says fourth step training. So, we're obviously talking about our moral inventories. It's what we introduced last week as we went through our brief little lesson last week. We're talking moral inventory. Right off the bat here, I want to try to make something a little bit clear, maybe, hopefully. There are two different inventories in this process. And maybe you've noticed that, maybe you haven't, that's okay. There's a moral inventory and there's a spiritual inventory, okay? I just put this away and said I didn't need it, but your spiritual inventory is kind of what's in your participant guide here, right? So if you look from lessons 10 and 11, wherever that is, we're looking at spiritual inventory, okay? We're not there quite yet. Right now we're talking moral inventory, okay? So moral inventory is going to be kind of the thing that you do individually, and it's for your eyes and maybe an accountability partner or a sponsor of some sort, okay? The spiritual inventory is what's done in the participant's guide, and that will be kind of one of the things that we base our discussion group on next week and the following week, okay? So I just want to start off here. There's two different inventories that we're talking about. Confusing, I know, right? But there's moral inventory, and then there's spiritual inventory. We're talking moral inventory right now. Again, spiritual inventory comes in lessons 10 and 11, and I'll actually put out a teaching video on that. It'll come out tomorrow, and then that will be the basis of our discussion for next week. Spiritual inventory. Okay, so From now on, what we're talking about right here is moral inventory. All right? So, moral inventory. Got that? Okay. Here's the deal. As you look through, as we start on this training guide, you're going to see some things here. First, it says we'll take a minimum of 2 or 3 months and maybe longer. And it says a healthy timeline is important to make good progress. Here's the deal. As you know, our step study, what we're doing here, is we're kind of tweaking a little bit just because we're in a unique situation where we're the beginning crew to launch this CR. So the timelines that are listed here, we will progress a little bit quicker than what it's talking about here. But what I do want you to hear is that this moral inventory thing is not like I'm setting an hour aside and then I'm going to be done, right? The whole idea here is this is a long process. It's a long journey. It's something that we want to take our time with. Just with our setting, we want to keep our step study moving forward, okay? So with that in mind, you'll begin working on your moral inventory. It's going to take time. Don't feel stressed out if when we get to, 2 weeks from now, your moral inventory is not completely done, right? It's okay, right? This is kind of your process, your pace kind of thing. Really, the ideal is that we are finished with our moral inventories by the time we start book 3, right? Right now we're in book 2. Kind of the general goal is we want to be done with our moral inventories when we move to book 3. Now, again, as with lots of things CR, there's DNA, but then there's also best practices. And then when it comes to best practices, there's a little bit of, there's grace, right? There's grace here. So kind of the ideal is, again, finishing before we start book 3. And CR will say that you'll get the full benefit of finishing your moral inventory by then. But if not, even if you don't have it completely finished by then, the reality is you're still going to get something good out of completing this whole process, right? So I say all that to say, like, don't panic about the timeline here, okay? It's not something that is like a race that has, I've got to crank this out in an hour or so. Like, we're going to take our time. We're going to progress at our own speeds. The important thing is that we're working through this process. Okay, the important thing is not necessarily finishing it by a deadline, but that we're actually working through this process. Does that make sense? On that note, we're not going to be checking in on you to be like, hey, how far are you on your moral inventory, right? We're not doing that. As with all of this recovery process, this is kind of a your responsibility thing, right? We get out of this what we put in and the effort that we put in. So the moral inventory police aren't going to come knocking at your door to see where you're at in this process. It's just kind of you're responsible for your own progress in that. Okay? Yes. It definitely is. It is. It really is. And yes, and one of the things, I can't remember if I have it in my notes here somewhere later or not, but one of the things that is highly suggested is kind of carrying some sort of notebook, or let's be honest, on our phones we have a notes app, you know what I mean? And so even in this initial part of your moral inventory, like, it's going to be like actually remembering all of the things in one setting is not realistic, right? But you may be going through your day and like, if your mind's like mine, it just starts wandering and thinking about things, and you're like, all of a sudden you're connecting dots. And so it's like, I'm going to pull up this note because I can't sit down and work on my moral inventory right now, but I want to remember this thought because it goes on there. So yes, it's a kind of working on it now, but also understanding that we're still living, right? And so because we're still living, then there's still potentially things that we will add to that. Yes, so absolutely, it's a doing it now, but also a continuous thing that we kind of work on. So, moving right along, on here it says it has a best practice of like, if for some reason you're not finished with your inventory by the time we begin book 4, it's suggested that you start over in a new step study. And so again, that's one of those things that like that's kind of what they say best practices. But again, we're not checking moral inventories to say like, are you ready to do this? But there may be a point where someone is like, I've gotten this far and I'm just really struggling with this moral inventory thing. I think it might be best if we start over again and just kind of work, you know what I mean? But there's a lot of kind of wiggle, kind of grace in this entire process. Super. I kind of already talked about the next thing there. Lessons 10 and 11 in the guide are spiritual inventories, which we share in group 2. But kind of the important thing there is, or as we work through the spiritual inventories, that'll also just kind of help us in our process of the moral inventories. So they're two separate things, but they go hand in hand and kind of they help us along with that process. So a note there may be information in your moral inventory that you never share in your group because of the personal nature of that, but that you would be, you'd be willing to share with your sponsor, with accountability partner, that kind of thing. Whereas with the spiritual inventory, that's kind of more set up to like, hey, we want to share this as a group. We want to work through this together, things like that. And then, yeah, that's good. We're good there. Super. Let's talk about the actual process here now. I'm going to have this sheet here ready, the other packet, just so you can see what we're talking about as we work through this. The first thing that we're going to talk about is kind of names and institutions, or the person. What's under the heading is the person. So as we can see, what was or is the object of my resentment or fear? Something that I want to point out here as we are working through this inventory process. Writing someone down in this first column does not mean necessarily that you're ready to make amends with that person right now, right? That comes later in the process. So one of the things that can be intimidating is like, oh, I'm writing this down right now. That means that I'm ready to move on. I'm ready to make amends and things like that, right? Don't worry about that. We're just getting it all out here, okay? The figuring out amends and working towards that comes later in the process. Just the whole idea here in this step is just getting it all down on paper, okay? We'll worry about whether or not you're ready for amends or things like that later. Just get it all on the paper. So it doesn't mean that you're ready to go make amends right now. It's important to just get it on there. So we have the person or the institution or the places. It's kind of the offender, if you will, if we're talking about the negatives, okay? Does that make sense on the person? Again, this is one of those things that memories are a funny thing, right? So you may work through this, and then you may pick it back up another week later, and you start remembering other things. So it's just this ongoing kind of process. I want to give a couple of kind of highlights through this entire rubric. I don't know, grid, I guess would be a good word. And then as we do that, we'll also kind of talk about like the layout of this, what this actually looks like. But I want to hit some key points here. Here we go. Sorry, I lost my spot in my iPad notes here. Okay, so on the we got the person, and then we've got the does that say the cross at the top? Why does that say the cross? That's incredible. That's supposed, well, I guess it could, maybe the cross. It's the cause everywhere else. I don't know why unless it's like that's the event or the like when they crossed you, you know? Yeah, I've never seen the cross there. In all of the other areas, they have it as the cause. So if you would like, you can just go ahead and cross off the cross and put, that completely threw me off. I'm looking at my notes and I'm like, wait, there is no cross off the cross, yes. Yeah, it's good pastoral advice. Cross out the cross. Yeah. The cause. So we're talking about the cause now. So first was the person, object, whatever. The second thing in the grid is the cause. What was the event that happened? What did they do? What did the institution do? What did whatever it was? What happened? Right? Now here's something. When you're writing this out, some people are journalers by nature or storytellers by nature. So it may be helpful for you to to write this out in long story form in a journal somewhere, like where you can process the story that happened. What I would say, though, is when it comes to kind of filling out your actual moral inventory, it will be helpful for you to then take your story, your long form answers, and kind of bullet point highlight some things, right? So that, because here's the whole, what we're getting here, but the whole idea here is that we now have a grid like this that is filled out all the way across. And what we can do is we can begin to see patterns in our lives. We can see patterns where our character defects are really kind of showing up. The whole idea here in this entire process is learning the patterns about our behaviors, right? What is causing me to do X, Y, Z? What's the root cause? And so while the journal form, kind of long story answer form might be helpful for you to process, when it comes to actually filling out your moral inventory, it will likely be more beneficial to be able to take some key points from that story and put them in your moral inventory. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah, Bob. Is it still, yeah. So I see what you're saying. There's not necessarily a person, it's a circumstance, right? I would say, so one of the other things, is it in there? Yeah. So if you actually flip to the back page of this, there are some more kind of some helps in thinking through these things. And you'll see names, institutions, places, and also issues. So that kind of like that section there is not just a person or a place. Like there are circumstances in life, or there are issues like chronic pain or something like that. Like that's maybe a circumstance or an issue that is kind of that's causing it. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so, Bob, you bring up a really good point that I think I actually skipped over in my notes. The idea here is the process and not perfection, right? So when we go through this, we're going to end up with things in incorrect columns or whatever. It's okay, right? It's about getting it down somewhere, right? As I think as we work through this, things will become more clear. But the reality is we're going to end up with something in the wrong spot, and that's okay, right? Yeah. So, good. So we have the person, the cause, and now we're looking at the effect. What effect did that action have on my life? When we're looking at the effects of that action, we're talking about things like feelings, emotions, shame or guilt or feelings of inadequacies because of this event or this person, right? We're talking about how has this affected me? How did it change my emotional state? How did it kind of interject some fears into my life? The other thing that may show up in terms of effect is our belief systems. And what that doesn't necessarily mean like religious belief systems, but belief systems more in terms of like what you believe about maybe a group of people. So just for instance, you may have been hurt by a man. And so your belief system has been shaped such that now you will say men are untrustworthy, right? Men cannot be trusted. See the belief system there? Your belief system about men has been affected, right? Men can't be trusted. So that's what we're talking about when it comes to belief system. So what was the effect of this event? What was the effect that it had on my life? Again, we're talking feelings, emotions, belief systems, shame, guilt, inadequacies in our life. Okay, that's the effect. Now, once we have effect, we're then going to the damage. What damage did this action have on my basic social security and or sexual instincts, right? So CR kind of gives this illustration. You knock over a lamp, right? Or something hits a lamp and breaks a lamp, right? The impact of whatever hits the lamp is the effect, right? It's the impact. But then what happens to the lamp? It shatters. So the shattering is the actual damage. Make a little bit of sense? Clear as mud, right? So you have the effects, but then you have the damage. So damages could be things like broken relationships, financial difficulties that you have as a result of this whatever cause and event. Maybe there's a fear of intimacy that is a result of this event, and so that's a damage. Maybe there's just a general distrust of people. That's something that is damaged. And then the other thing that comes into play when we're talking about damage is character defects. So perhaps something has happened that has caused low self-esteem in your life, right? Low self-worth, self-value, right? That's damage. That's the damage that has happened because of this. That's the character defect. And so we're looking at what was the damage that happened because of this event, right? I had a note right here that I wanted to make sure sorry, no, that was for a different one. My bad. So we have person or object, cause of the event, the effect, the damage, and then the last column that we look at is my part. My part, okay? Now, here's where I mentioned this last week when we kind of gave an overview here, okay? When it comes to things like abuse of any sort, the first thing that should always be written on the my part column is either nothing or not guilty, right? Because here's the deal. We're looking at my part, and then we're looking at maybe there's an instance of abuse, or even beyond abuse, there may be things where it's like, my role in this happening was actually nothing. I had no part in this, so I'm not guilty. There's nothing that is my part, okay? And that is the first and foremost important step, right? And here's what I would say to go even further there is someone else's actions or reaction to a situation is actually never your fault, right? You don't get to choose how someone else reacts. I say that because there are times when when things happen here and when we actually look at it, you're like, maybe I did play a role in the situation as a whole. But we never want to place the guilt or the shame of what someone did to us on us because we can't control their actions or their reactions to a situation. Does that make sense? So when it actually comes down to their actions that they have done, the responsibility on our part is nothing or not guilty. Okay? So what does the my part come into play? Well, it comes into play in a lot of different ways. Maybe in that situation, I did have a role to play in just the overall negativity of a relationship. Maybe, right? Maybe the way that I think that this probably would be even more common would be the character defects that come out in the damage part. The character defects are part of the damage, and my part comes into play when I'm not willing to kind of seek the help that I need to overcome those character defects. So a lot of times you'll see, let's see, in one of these, I forget which one. Yeah. So on the back page, right behind step 4, you'll actually see character defects in the damage column and in the my part column. It's important to note that the actual character defect itself is not your part, right? Like the low self-esteem that you may have from a situation, that's not your part. But when it becomes my part is, now that I've recognized this, am I willing to do what it takes to work through that? Does that make sense? So that's why you'll see character defects. The other thing is the my part. What you'll see is things like choices that you've made because of these events, right? Again, not saying that the event itself was I had any part in that, but again, our reactions, our actions because of that, our choices because of that, that's my part. So an easy way, so this is an example that they gave in the kind of this training system to kind of understand the my part versus the effect/damage would be someone who experienced kind of some sort of hurt within a church. Okay, and so because this hurt happened within a church, then they're no longer going to church, right? They're not going to church because of whatever has happened. Okay, it's easy to think that I'm no longer in church, and that's the effect or the damage that has happened. But the reality is that's actually the choice that was made because of the effect. And that in no way diminishes the effect or the damage, right? It just acknowledges that I made the choice because of the effect and the damage. I've made the choice to do this or to not do that, right? So that kind of helps distinguish the effect and damage from my part. My part is now, what have I done with this? Like, or what have I done because of this? Or what has caused me, or what addictions or compulsions have come out of these particular instances? That's the my part of this. Another just kind of instance here. When it comes to abuse, let's just go with the abuse thing. The abuse is obviously, your part in that is nothing, not guilty, right? When does it become my part, though? When we choose to continue the cycle, right? So then in turn, when I choose to abuse or hurt, then that's my part, right? The person, the cause, the effect, the damage, none of that is my responsibility. But what is my responsibility is what I do in turn with that. Does that make sense? Does that clear it up a little bit? Maybe? Okay. Super. So those are the columns. When it comes to working on your inventory, this really is your process. Like, figuring out how this looks for you is entirely depending on how you operate, right? Some people may find that it's helpful to just start listing out the people or the institutions that have caused hurt, and just kind of working down that way, and then going to the next column and working that. Others of you may be more kind of linear thinking, so it's like, okay, this was the person, this was that cause, this was that effect, this was that damage, and this is my part. Working through that. Honestly, however you want to do that is totally up to you. As I've been thinking through this and figuring out what I want to do, I'll probably create an Excel spreadsheet. Just because that just will kind of help me. And it's also something I can have in the cloud, and I think of something, I can add it on there. So probably tomorrow I will create an Excel spreadsheet, and I'll just send that out there. Obviously not with my stuff on it. It'll be blank, so you can fill out your own thing. I'm not sharing all that with you guys. You guys are crazy. Yeah, I will send before I start filling anything in. So I'll send that out if that's kind of the way that you operate. Then you can obviously do that. So it's your process. I'm kind of jumping back and forth between the things here, and I apologize. But if you go to the back page of the 4th step training guide, about a third of the way down or so, the helpful information about writing your inventory. Again, whichever works best for you in terms of down the columns or across the rows. You can use a diary, a journal, Excel spreadsheet, notebook paper, whatever you want to do. It's your process. You can do however. And like we mentioned before, if you don't remember specific parts of your life, that's okay. Just skip it. Also, when it comes to different spots in the columns, if you're struggling to get to it, like if you're like, man, I just cannot figure out what the damage, that's okay. You can skip it and work, and go on. Come back to that later. Again, all that to say, like, this is your process. It's for your benefit. So don't get caught up on this is exactly how it has to look. And then there's the thing here, like the notepad or notes in your phone to kind of work through this. The other thing I wanted to kind of point out and highlight here, it's actually highlighted in here. This is important, is sometimes we have issues in our lives that we've kind of already worked through. And we're like, you know what, I've moved on from that and I've healed from that. It's still important that we put that in there, right? Because what we're looking to do is discover patterns in our lives. And so even though we've worked through an issue or an event that has happened to us, we still want to put it on the inventory. That way it'll just help us to kind of recognize those patterns that are happening. You know what can also be helpful there in acknowledging that is like, oh, this was a pattern in this that I've worked through, and I'm seeing that pattern start to happen again in this area. What did I learn from this that I can maybe apply to this thing? So even if you're like, I've worked through that, that's not an issue in my life anymore, still put it down on there just so you can kind of see those patterns in your life. And again, it's about process, not perfection. Another helpful thing to remember is keep your inventory in a safe place. It's your inventory. And so it's like you want it to be a place where you can put everything. Now again, you want to share that with a sponsor or accountability partner, whatever. That's great, but it's not for public consumption, right? So that's the other nice thing about a kind of an Excel sheet or whatever. You can password protect an Excel sheet and things like that, or whatever you want to do. Get a little journal that has a little cute lockbox thing, like teenagers have. Right? The last thing in terms of that I want to highlight in terms of just some helpful things is keeping it balanced. I think we touched on this a little bit last week, but I want to really touch on it again today, is keeping this balanced. And the reason that we try to keep our moral inventories balanced is really a self-care type of thing, right? Because as you can imagine, as we're looking through our lives, however many years you've been walking this earth, and you're taking inventory of these things, and there's a lot of negative things that have happened, it is easy to kind of become overwhelmed by the negativity that you're bringing up. And so we want to keep this balanced simply as a method of self-care, right? There may be times where you're working through this and you have to take a breather, right? Like, this is a lot, and so I need to walk away for a few minutes. I need to go do something else. I would say this. I would say in this process, there will be difficult times, and so maybe if you're like me, the tendency would be, I need a breather. This is really difficult, and my breather becomes like an infinitely long breather, right? Because I'm just like, ooh, I don't want to go back to that again. I'm still taking a deep breath, and so then that breather becomes procrastination. And so I think it's important that we push ourselves, but we don't break ourselves, right? It's okay to push ourselves, but to the point of breaking ourselves is probably not ideal. So use some balance for some of that self-care. And so what does that look like? What's that balance look like? I think if you'll see in the packet later, we can go there. But there's also a positive sheet. And so if you want to do this as well, you have a negative sheet and a positive sheet. So it's like we obviously can see how negative things affect our lives in a negative way, and that's why we need recovery, right? But it's important for our balance, for our self-care, to also talk about positives. And so things like people who have actually been such a tremendous blessing to you, or who have shaped you in a positive way, who have done things, or events in your life that have really shaped who you are in a positive way. It's important to also acknowledge those positive things, right? Yeah, yep, and yep, 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 absolutely, yep. Which I think is an extremely healthy thing to acknowledge, to get to the point where we can acknowledge the paradox. Yeah. hmm Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Can't beat that, really. I mean, no, I think that's exactly right, Rodney. Is I think we will notice that, yeah, some of the people who have hurt us are also the ones who show up in our positive things, right? Yeah. And so being able to recognize and acknowledge that, again, that paradox, and to hold that into tension, and come to terms with that is, I think that's an important part of the recovery process, for sure. So the CR kind of suggests if you can, doing a one-to-one positive to negatives. So for every negative that you come up with, also work to come up with a positive. If it turns out you have more positive than negatives, praise the Lord, right? That's okay too. But it's imagining, it's trying to balance the scale, really for a self-care thing. So also just some other things to remember as you're working through this. Remember those positive things. They encourage you to kind of also find some of the 7,000 promises that God makes in the Bible as a way to kind of, as you're working through this, remembering these promises. Most importantly, that even in this process of difficult recovery, that God is with us, right? So remembering things like that. Your accountability team, your step study groups, things like that are important in this process to kind of keep a perspective of, like, these things have happened, but I'm not a terrible person, right? Like, I'm still who I am. And then they just kind of recommend some general self-care things in the midst of this. Don't just beat yourself up, right? Like, do some positive things, hanging out, fishing, reading, whatever. I went fishing this past weekend, and I was just reminded that I'm not a fisherman. Sorry, that was total rabbit, squirrel, sidetrack moment. Not a fisherman. Anyway, so balance negative with the positives. Actually, you know what? Let's do this. Let's take a 3-minute stretch break. Hi, everyone. Here we go. Lesson number 10. This is starting the spiritual inventory process. So this is going to be part 1 of a 2-part series on spiritual inventory. Next week will be part 2. It's just kind of a long process, and so we're kind of splitting it up into 2 weeks. We're still on principle 4, openly examine and confess my faults to myself, to God, and to someone I trust. And then it's also still part of step 4, where we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And so here we go. working in, hopefully from the training, the moral inventory training, we kind of understand a little bit of the difference. So I think as we just dive in here for the spiritual inventory, it'll begin to make even more sense. And so let's rock and roll. Again, we're starting with first of two lessons when we look at our spiritual inventory. This is just kind of a process called the spiritual evaluation that Rick Warren developed, and so kind of tied in with CR. So principle 4 begins the process of coming clean. It's where we openly examine and confess our faults to ourselves, to God, and to another person that we trust. But the reality is that most of us don't like to look within ourselves for the same reason we don't really like to open an email or open a text or listen to a voicemail that we know has bad news. But remember what we talked about a couple weeks ago in lesson 9, or last week I guess it was. You need to keep your evaluation, your inventory balanced. It needs to include both the good and the bad within us. And so let's jump in. Let's take a look at what this spiritual inventory or spiritual evaluation is all about. In Psalm 139, God's word tells us, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test my thoughts. Point out anything you find in me that makes you sad, and lead me along the path of everlasting life." I don't know if you've ever heard this or not, but everyone kind of has 3 different characters. 1, the character that we exhibit. 2, the character we think we have. And then 3 is the character that we truly have. No doubt that each one of us has good qualities and some bad qualities. And so we're going to take a look at some of the bad, some of the negative, some of the character shortcomings, or maybe even sins that can kind of block us from fully living in the joy that God has intended for us. Tonight or today or whenever you may be watching this, we're going to work on 4 areas of our character, and then next week we'll come back and we'll do 4 more areas of our character. And so this exercise, as I mentioned in our training, kind of this is one that will kind of help us along the way of our moral inventory, because we're really starting to kind of search within us, and so they go hand in hand, although they're 2 separate things. So the first area that we're going to look at is in our relationship with others. Matthew 6:12-14, Jesus tells us to pray, "Forgive us our sins, just as we have forgiven those who have sinned against us. Don't bring us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." Ask yourself the following questions regarding your relationship with others. Who has hurt you, and against whom have you been holding a grudge? It doesn't take a rocket scientist or a doctor of some sort to tell us that it's better to remove a grudge than to nurse it. The reality is that no matter how long you nurse a grudge, it doesn't just get better. Writing the grudge down in our inventory is the first step of getting rid of it, acknowledging it, writing it down. Another question to kind of ask is, against whom are you still seeking revenge? Did you know that seeking revenge is like biting a dog just because the dog bit you? It really doesn't help you or the dog. Another question in terms of relationship with others, are you jealous of someone? Song of Songs 8:6, jealousy is said to be as unyielding as the grave. It burns like blazing fire. The next question to ask is, have you tried to justify your bad attitude by saying it's their fault? Found that when we're searching for someone to blame, it's better for us to look in the mirror rather than through binoculars to find someone else to blame. Hosea 4:4 tells us, don't point your finger at someone else and try to pass the blame. The people that we name in these areas, kind of as you can see, these will also go in column 1 of our moral inventory worksheet. The next question in regards to relationship with others is, who have you hurt? How did you hurt them? You may have hurt them unintentionally, or maybe it was intentional. Another question is, who have you been critical of or gossiped about? It's not that difficult to make a mountain out of a molehill. All you got to do is just add a little dirt on it. And that's what gossip is, just a little dirt. It's pretty amazing that a tongue, just about 4 inches long or so,
can destroy a 6-foot tall man. So James 1:26 tells us to keep a tight rein on our tongues. The people that you name in these areas, again, we're tying this to our moral inventory. So the people that you name in this area are the ones that will go in column 5 of your moral inventory, because it's those that you have hurt. It's my part, right? So we talked about relationships with others. The next area we're going to look at in our spiritual inventory, spiritual evaluation, is the priorities in our lives. The reality is that we do what's important to us. Others see our priorities by our actions and not our words. So the question is, what are the priorities in your life? Matthew 6:33 tells us what will happen if we make God our number one priority. It says he will give to you if you give him first place in your life as he wants you to. So some questions to think about in terms of this area. After making the decision to turn your life and your will over to God, in what areas of your life are you still not putting God first? What closet are you not letting him enter into and clean out? What in your past is interfering with your doing God's will? Your ambition, is it driven by serving God, or is it driven by envy, or is it driven by your pleasures? If your pleasure has been found in the world, Proverbs 21:17 warns us, he who loves pleasure will become poor. Is your pleasure now found in Jesus Christ? Psalm 16:11 tells us, you will teach me how to live a holy life. Being with you will fill me with joy. At your right hand I will find pleasure forever. What about your job? What about your friendships? What have been your priorities in your job, your friendship, your personal goal? Were they just self-centered and self-serving goals? Selfishness turns into a life of burden, but unselfishness turns burden into life. And another question in this area, who did your priorities affect? What was good about your priorities? What was wrong with your priorities? So priorities. Next, we're going to look at our attitude. The next area we're going to examine in our spiritual inventory is your attitude. Ephesians 4:31 says, get rid of all bitterness, passion, and anger. No more shouting insults, no more hateful feelings of any sort. So some questions to think about here. Do you always try to have an attitude of gratitude, or do you find yourself complaining about your circumstances? In what areas of your life have you been ungrateful? If we can't be grateful for the bad things in our life that we have received, we can at least be thankful for what we might have escaped, right? And the one thing we can all be grateful for is found in 1 Corinthians 15:57. Where it says, but thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Have you gotten angry or easily blow up at people? Have you been sarcastic? Another thing to think about in terms of your attitude is what in your past is still causing you fear or anxiety. As we've said before, your fear imprisons you. Your faith can liberate you. Fear paralyzes while faith empowers. Fear disheartens and faith encourages. Fear sickens, faith heals. Faith in Jesus Christ can allow us to face our past fears. And with faith, we can be free of fear's chains. 1 John 4:18 says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. So the last area we're going to look at in this week's spiritual inventory is integrity, your integrity. Colossians 3:9 tells us, do not lie to each other. You have left your old sinful life and the things you did before. On what past dealings were you dishonest? Have you stolen things in your past? Have you exaggerated yourself to make yourself look better? In what areas of your past have you used false humility? You know, humility is never gained by seeking it. To think we have it is sure proof that we probably don't. And then lastly, have you pretended to live one way in front of your Christian friends and another way at your home or at work? So those are the 4 areas that we're looking at in our spiritual inventory for this week. We've got some more next week. But as you start the work on your spiritual inventory, I want you to remember two things. First, Isaiah 1:18, God says, no matter how deep the stain of your sins, I can take it. I can take it out and make you as clean as freshly fallen snow. The second thing to remember is what you've been hearing this entire time with moral and spiritual inventory. Keep your inventory balanced. List the positive new relationships that you have, or the areas of your life that you have been able to turn over to God. How your attitude has improved since you've been in recovery. The ways you've been able to step out of your denial and into God's truth. Keeping your inventory balanced. So, I hope to take some time this week to work on that first part of your spiritual inventory, and we will gather together next week and discuss that, and then finish up the spiritual inventory part. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great day or night or whenever you may be watching this.